Good morning. My name is Andrew Mould. I'm the Chief of Regional Integration at the Economic Commission for Africa, the Sub-Regional Office for Eastern Africa. And I'm going to take you through a regional overview of the economic and social impact of the COVID-19 crisis. Firstly, the economic impact. For the African continent, this crisis has represented the largest economic contraction in the last 27 years, with a minus 3.4% decline in GDP. However, if we look at Eastern Africa's performance, although it's gone into negative territory in terms of economic growth, you see that it's been less impacted than the global average, with a contraction of 0.7% on average for the 14 countries of Eastern Africa. Now, a good question to ask is, why has this been the case? Why the relative resilience? First of all, one of the characteristics of the region, which is normally considered a disadvantage, the lack of structural change, has actually proved to be advantageous during this time of global crisis. Firstly, agriculture is a higher share of GDP than globally, at around a third of GDP for the majority of countries in the sub-region. And this sector has been relatively less impacted than higher value-added services, for instance. Secondly, the region has had relatively little success in terms of integration into global value chains, and that reduced the region's vulnerability to these global impacts of the pandemic. Another characteristic of the region, which I think helped towards the relative resilience of the region, is, despite the fact the region is urbanizing very rapidly now, the absolute levels of urbanization are still very low compared to global averages. And that again reduced the transmission of COVID-19. A third extremely important factor to stress is the demographics of Eastern Africa. It's a very young population. And one study, for example, early on compared the expected death rates between Uganda and Italy, given the same rate of infections, and found that in Uganda, because over half the population is under 20 years old, in actual fact, the number of mortalities would be around 10% of the Italian level. So demographics have played in favor of the region during this pandemic. Finally, we have to stress also that while some countries have been quite strict in terms of implementing lockdowns, others have not. And as a consequence, there's been a diversity of approaches to the pandemic, and the economies which didn't have strict lockdowns, their economies continued to expand relatively. I think we can illustrate these global trends by just having a look at three economies. Firstly, the largest economy in the region, Kenya, where we saw a sharp reversal in the second quarter of its GDP because of the pandemic and the measures implemented to tackle the pandemic. Still declining in the third quarter. We don't yet have the fourth quarterly growth, but there seems to have been some recovery in the final quarter of the year. Contrast this performance with the landlocked Rwanda, which has quite a high dependency on services, and you see that the decline was more acute, with a very large drop of 12.4% GDP in the second quarter, and still declining GDP, though more moderately, in the third and fourth quarter. And finally, Seychelles, which is a highly tourism-dependent economy, where you see that the economic impact has been extremely severe. One important question about this crisis is whether it has been inflationary. Now, in a recent study by Daly and Chankov, they review whether pandemics are typically inflationary or deflationary. And they find that typically inflation remains weak after pandemics. In this particular case, though, there's a lot of concern about the way the response is being financed, the long-term financing implications, and concerns have been voiced about rising global inflation. In our particular sub-region, we see that some countries have had a problem with inflation, but it's been mostly driven by domestic factors rather than global ones for the time being. Now, one interesting dimension to this is, of course, the commodity price shifts which occurred over the course of 2020. And in actual fact, these have also worked generally to the favor of Eastern Africa up to this point. So for example, we see the largest increases in precious metals, and countries in the region are exporters. A number of countries export gold, for example, and have benefited from the increased revenue from those sources. Some food price inflation started to become apparent at some points in 2020, and that's actually, we've seen an increase in the global price inflation for foods over the course of 2021. Most notably for Eastern Africa, as a net fuel importing region, we see that the decline in fuel prices has been very pronounced, and that again helped balance the payments for the countries in the region. There has, of course, been a lot of pressure on fiscal balances for countries across the region as their revenue sources have dried up and as expenditures have had to expand to deal with the economic contraction. So we see a very significant rise in fiscal imbalances for a number of countries in the region. And also, of course, this is carried through to rising debt levels, most pronounced in the case of Seychelles, but also noticeable in countries such as Burundi and Rwanda. One surprising element in the crisis has been actually the rapidity in the rebound in regional trade. A number of countries have reported actually quite sharp increases in their exports despite the crisis. Part of this is due to a shift towards mineral exports during this crisis. As I noted earlier, the issue of higher prices for gold, for example. But it also reflects measures taken in the region to protect regional trade. Exports are up in 9 of 14 Eastern African countries compared to their 2019 levels, which, given the scale of the global pandemic, of course, is really quite extraordinary. Imports, on the other hand, fell in about half the countries. So as a result, overall trade balances in merchandise trade at least have generally improved, although that is not, of course, the case once we take into the service trade balance into account, particularly because a number of countries in the region are very important receivers of tourism. So let me turn quickly now to the social impact. In terms of COVID numbers, Eastern Africa has been relatively spared, certainly in terms of the official recorded cases of COVID, in terms of the number of deaths and number of cases. And there's a number of reasons for this. Partly because countries in the region did adopt measures to control the crisis early on in a number of cases. And the swift response in the region also reflects the fact that the region is no stranger to pandemics. Ebola, for example, there's a lot of experience in controlling contagious diseases of this kind. So in terms of the absolute numbers, the case numbers are relatively low, the recorded case numbers at least. However, the crisis has highlighted considerable gaps in regional health systems. So health spending per capita, reflecting low per capita incomes, is extraordinarily low in the region. In the cases of countries like Ethiopia, it doesn't reach more than $25 per capita, compared to a continental average of $114. So these kind of spending patterns, when you compare it to, for example, North America, I believe United States is around $10,000 per year per person, you can appreciate that the resources are relatively limited to dealing with this kind of global pandemic. And of course, there is the problem of the region of other communicable diseases, which still tend to be a leading cause of death in Eastern Africa compared with the rest of the world. So for example, perinatal and nutrition conditions account for more than half of the deaths in the region. And there is concern that attention on the crisis of the pandemic has actually detracted from some of these longer term developmental health goals. Finally, school closures across the region have, of course, impacted negatively on learning. Over the last couple of decades, we've seen very sharp increases in primary and secondary school enrollments across the region. But of course, this has been very negatively impacted by school closures. And without the recourse to internet, for example, it's been difficult for students to continue studying under this period. So there's a considerable longer-term economic loss in terms of education. So this brings me quickly to my conclusions about this. The first thing I think is the major concern is a return to the high growth path possible. Eastern Africa was one of the fastest growing regions in the world prior to this pandemic. And the concern is that the forecasts that we have seen so far suggest that it's not going to return anytime soon to that fast rate of growth. This is very important because, as I mentioned earlier, the demographic pressures are very high in the region. So to translate economic growth into real rises of per capita income, Eastern Africa needs to sustain significantly higher rates of economic growth than the global average. A second point is it's exposed weaknesses in terms of fiscal revenues, and debt levels have become particularly high in a number of countries. So this is going to be a challenge going forward, and partly will depend on the response of the international community in terms of providing provisions for less developed countries. And finally, I think most crucially, the crisis has really negatively impacted on employment prospects for many parts of the population in Eastern Africa, particularly many parts of the population dependent on informal sector. So there's going to be a need to accelerate employment creation, for example, by higher fiscal expenditures again on infrastructure, which are very employment creation intensive. So thank you very much. I hope that's provided you with a good overview of the situation in Eastern Africa. And I hope you have a very enjoyable conference and seminar. Thank you. Bye-bye.